Hello, my name's Dr. Steven Stolz and I'm from La Trobe University. I just want to talk to you about a co-edited book titled Theory and Philosophy in Educational Research, Methodological Dialogues. My colleagues who I collaborated with in this edited book is Dr. John Quay from the University of Melbourne, Dr. Jennifer Bleazby from Monash University, Dr. Maurizio Toscano from the University of Melbourne and Dr. Scott Webster from Deakin University. Each of us had this great privilege to interview leading international scholars from around the world, and part of the project was to ask them a series of questions which they all received, and as a result the dialogues that were generated form the basis of the book that will be published by Routledge in early 2018. Hi John, how are you?
G'day Steve, good, thanks.
Thanks for being here today. We might just start off here, if you can tell us a little bit, maybe as succinctly as possible, about the first chapter that we did together as a editorial group.
Yes. So the first chapter is a chapter written by all the editors, and it is an opening chapter to the book. And as the subtitle says, it opens up that conversation about research that is focusing on those methodological dialogues that make up the main part of the book. But in opening that conversation, we needed to think about the readers of the book, colleagues, other academics working in education research, but also and especially research students, people coming to education research for the first time. So, and we're familiar with how people engage initially with education research, especially about methodology, thinking that it might be something they need to choose, am I going to do this methodology or that methodology? So trying to help people through those issues by using the analogy of catering. And so in the first part of that chapter, we look at synergies between researching and catering. It sounds a bit awkward, but it actually works quite well. A recipe is sometimes used as an analogy for method. But then we very much want to move beyond that. So that's just an introduction. So in the second part of the chapter, we're looking at the complexities and the intricacies of the location of theory in educational research. So utilising a particular theoretical approach, mainly through the works of Dewey and Peirce. And then really important, the third part of the chapter takes that analogy with catering to the level of the notion of cuisines. So cuisines as methodologies, and when we see methodologies in that way, we can understand that there's a bigger picture here of what's going on in terms of the judgments that are being made in terms of the research process. So cuisines incorporate all sorts of judgments of taste and flavour and norms in terms of cooking and recipes, as do methodologies, and so that sheds light on that part of the process.
And so in particular, this first chapter, who do you think would be an ideal reader or an audience, if you like, for that first chapter?
Yeah, so a research student, entering into the field of education research, of course, but also it's not just a chapter for the beginner. It very much is a chapter that will assist and help all academics working in education research to get another angle on how research works. So it's not the simple, this is how to do education research. It's not a simple, this is where theory sits.
So it's not going to be like a recipe, like I'm a cook and who follows a recipe?
Not at all.
No. So no. I know you talked about the analogy, but that's a nice point of clarification, really. It's not going to be a recipe as such, is it?
No. So we look at that, and that enables us to raise that as an issue where some research guides do talk about following a recipe as your method, but that sits within a much broader frame of understanding, which we can then explore through the second and third parts of the chapter.
John, tell us a little bit about Chapter 2 here by Peter Roberts, and the chapter of that title is Theory as Research, Philosophical Work in Education. I've got a feeling the subtitle's a little precursor to a little bit about what Peter's written about.
Yeah, so thanks, Steve. Yeah, Peter raises a very important issue that is situated fantastically as that Chapter 2, just before we get into these methodological dialogues. And Peter's making the point that rather than think about theory and research, we need to think about theory as research.
Yes.
And actually moving right down to the last chapter, Lyn Yates makes that same point in relation to, is theoretical work so different than empirical work that they can't be discussed, together. So the notion of theory and theoretical work contributes to, well, is a contribution of philosophy of education. So those aspects of educational research, are highlighted by Peter. And he also takes us on a little journey into some of the practical aspects of that, methods, methodologies, and theoretical frameworks that are very important to understanding some of the dialogues that we've engaged in through the rest of the book.
Yes. Hi Jennifer, how are you?
Good, thanks.
Thanks for being here today. Jennifer's going to talk a little bit about her collaboration with Michael Apple, and if I were to ask you one thing, maybe succinctly if possible, maybe one or two things to maybe Joe Blow in the street, what was probably one thing that you probably took away from your collaboration?
So Michael Apple, of course, is known all over the world in education. Specifically, I guess he's best known as a critical theorist and as an advocate of critical pedagogy, and he was one of the key people who brought that to America, and also as a neo-Marxist. And I think one of the interesting things was Michael Apple said that he often feels like he's pigeonholed into those categories when he actually uses quite a wide range of different theories, including various forms of feminist theory, American pragmatism, critical race theory, and a whole wide range of theories, as well as methodologies. And so I think one thing that was really interesting was he actually emphasised that point of he worries that people in education kind of pigeonhole themselves a bit by they'll do things like say, I'm a critical theorist, therefore I better only use qualitative research or pure theory because quantitative research is bad, and that's like associated with neoliberalism. And he thought that was really problematic, that we all should be trying to learn as many different methodologies and theories relevant to education as we can, and use them as much as possible. And in particular, he said, even if you want to criticise testing or the use of statistics, and as he's done in education, then you really ought to know about statistics, and you shouldn't think that's not relevant to you. So that was a key thing he really emphasised, and I think some people will be surprised, might be surprised by some of those comments.
Sure. And of course, I'm going to interview myself, which I'm sure a lot of psychoanalysts would read a lot into, but I'm not going to. My chapter with Gert Biesta on thinking philosophically about education, thinking educationally about philosophy and educational research, although a very long titled chapter, I found quite challenging, not necessarily the first or former part of the title, it was more the second part of the title that I found really challenging. So thinking educationally about philosophy and educational research, for me, felt really kind of nonsensical, and it did until I actually started to engage with Gert Biesta more closely, particularly when we came to edit and write sections of the chapter together, the introduction and the conclusion I'm thinking of in particular. But the latter part of the title became a little bit more clear to me about Gert Biesta's perspective from a continental tradition. Challenges you to think more about what education can mean, as opposed to it's just an application of philosophy in education. And so that, for me, I found not only challenging, but it also helped me come to a realisation that there's a little bit more to what's going on in that space, particularly within the continental tradition, and in particular the contribution the continental tradition can make to education. That would certainly be one thing that I took away from my chapter with Gert Biesta. Let's talk about chapter 5 with Penny Enslin on liberal feminism, justice and education. One or two things that you would like to share with everyone about your collaboration with her.
So Penny Enslin is, in particular, uses a liberal feminism as her main theorist, but also integrates lots of different views. I think one thing that was interesting about speaking to Penny is liberal political philosophy has contributed a lot to philosophy of education, but it's not all that popular anymore. Like, you don't see a lot of research students using it. And she talked a bit about her concern about fads in terms of theory and as methodologies as well, so that liberalism, as it kind of went out of fashion a bit, I guess, because postmodernism became popular and emphasis on diversity and multiculturalism. And people assume that's incompatible with liberalism because it focuses on things like universal rights. And I think that's really problematic because liberalism has had so much to offer to education. And she talks about how liberalism is compatible with things like multiculturalism and diversity. In fact, people often use universal rights to defend minority cultures and their rights to express themselves and to access their culture. So, and I think she's probably the only person who really uses liberalism extensively in the book, so that's really a unique contribution. And she talks a lot about, how to use that theory to look at global issues in education today.
Maurice, thanks for coming in today. Appreciate you being here. Tell us a little bit about your collaboration with John Hattie in Chapter 6 here, titled here, John Hattie on Interpretation, the Story of Research and Necessity of Falsifiability. Tell us a little bit about John Hattie's been in the media a lot, particularly with education and teacher education. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who will have an interest in this chapter and what he has to say. So one or two things.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, John Hattie's quite famous as a psychometrician. I mean, someone who's in the business of using large data sets in order to investigate claims about what is effective in education in particular. So it's about analysis, collection of the data, analysis of the data, and interpretation of that data with the view of having some impact on education policy and practices, really making a difference. I think that was the clear message from John. He wants to do quantitative research in order to have some impact on the community. And part of his argument there is that it's not just about the data and it's not just about cranking the handle on quantitative work, but it's about developing an interpretation. And he feels that the interpretive aspect of the quantitative work is not as emphasised as much, that people are thinking that the data speaks for itself in some way. And that means that not only do you have to have an interpretation, but you also have to couch it as a story which would resonate or be attuned with the end users, if you like, the teaching community, that they have a sense of understanding whether it works or it doesn't. And that means that I think he couches his work in providing this interpretation and this story of research and having its impact in the sense of it being bold and courageous, that you put out that idea, that interpretation, and you let the community prove you wrong. And so I think one of the surprising aspects of his research, which people may not be familiar with, is this idea that he relies very heavily on the philosophy of Karl Popper, who said you're not there to confirm your ideas, but to set it up in such a way that they can be falsified, that you can take them down. And so I think that's something which people may find quite striking, is his kind of...
hence the title.
Yeah, his philosophical commitment to Karl Popper and his work. And so he encourages people to be courageous in their research and their interpretation and let others judge them harshly.
John, thanks for coming in to talk about your collaboration with Nel Noddings. So Chapter 7 here, Nel Noddings on Care Theory and Caring Practice. A couple of insights from your collaboration with Nel Noddings.
Yeah, well, I think most people will be aware that Nel Noddings' work in care theory. So care theory, talking about theory, and is a contribution to this book that is about theory and philosophy and education research. And Nel's main contribution in relation to care theory is that it's a reciprocal act. So if I care for somebody, but that person isn't aware of that care, well, is that actually a caring interaction? And Nel would suggest that maybe it's not, or it isn't. And so that reciprocity, that interaction with care, so someone caring for and someone being cared for by are important to that. And she situates that at the heart of education. So teacher, student, students, all those relationships need to be caring for them to work in education. But another aspect of the chapter that I found very interesting was the origins of her theoretical work. So, at the time when she was developing this theory, she was a mother and a mathematics teacher, and with an interest in being a philosopher of education. So care theory actually, for her, brought those three things together as a way of understanding how education works, through teaching, but also that parent, connection and parent responsibility, and the philosophy. So all those three together evolved into care theory.
And my chapter on chapter 8 here with Michael Peters on science, genealogy and openness in educational research. Very interesting chapter. If you have read any of Michael's work or have known him or met him, you'll see he's a very dynamic individual. And his ideas, which may seem to be fragmented or not, he has very clear methodology, I should say method and methodology. But what I found particularly interesting is his concept of openness. I found that challenging, and it took me a while to reflect. It took me a while after reflection and consideration and conversation with some of my colleagues that I come to a realisation about what Michael means by that use of that concept. I'm not going to ruin that for you. That's part of you buying this book and reading it, but that was certainly, the title certainly helps and leads to what he means by that with science and genealogy as part of that concept of openness. Scott, welcome.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks for coming in today to talk a little bit about your chapter with Richard Pring. Your chapter here, chapter 9, Richard Pring on making research, educational research. One or two things that you took away from your collaboration with Richard.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I had the privilege of being in dialogue with Richard there, and one of the things that he's been on about for so many years is the phenomenon of education being front and centre when it comes to educational research. If we claim that our research is not specifically psychological or sociological, but is specifically educational, then what does it mean to be educated, to be an educator, and to have experiences which are indeed educational? And so Richard put a great emphasis upon this phenomenon, and he's argued very clearly that, you know, even empirical research, research in the classroom, where you're looking at student results and perceived impacts of certain interventions, etc., research within those phenomena certainly requires some philosophy, some philosophical thinking as to what makes this worthwhile, what makes this an example of, say, education rather than indoctrination. And so he looks at even the concepts of teaching and learning and unpacks them a little bit more deeply and say, what sorts of teaching, what sorts of learning are we putting value in terms of education? And so he warns researchers not to rush in with certain tools like, I'm going to be a quantitative researcher or I'm going to be a qualitative researcher. He says, well, hold on, first up, think about what's the exact phenomenon that you want to research and what makes it particularly of educational interest. And one of his main things that he focuses on, and it comes out in the dialogue here, is what it might mean to be an educated person. Not somebody who's simply informed or who knows a lot of things, but what does it mean to be an educated person? And this, for Richard, is one of the key aspects in educational research for him as a philosopher.
Your other chapter now with Paul Smeyers here on perspective on educational research. Tell us a little bit about your insights from your collaboration with Paul.
Well, I think one of the wonderful things about the conversation I had with Paul was that he gave this kind of overview of philosophy of education, really, and its place within research in a much broader context. So in some ways, he kind of situated in the context of contemporary research practices in universities and the relationship with education and the kinds of problems which show up in education. And he's very clear that when you're doing educational research, it's often directed at a specific problem. You know, your focus in educational research is very narrow. But when people are engaged in educational research, what they find is that the kinds of problems they're trying to solve are not necessarily easily tractable. It's not like you can develop a scientific model of investigating that and, you know, wash your hands and say, now we have very clear responses, which means that educational research inevitably raises challenges to your preconceived ideas of what is education and what is research. And so Paul makes the point that in a sense forces the researcher to think back on themselves, that the nature of the research asks you to reflect on your own understanding in that Nietzschean way that that philosophy asks you to do some work on yourself. And I think that's his point, is that philosophical research is that kind of practice, and that's why it's useful as a form of research, because it's dealing with these complex ideas that require that kind of self-reflection. So what he's arguing for is a kind of return, or a return to an Aristotelian wisdom in research. And I guess the other major strand that went through our conversation is the realisation, or coming to terms with the fact that academic culture today is not necessarily compatible with that kind of stance.
And the last chapter, John, let's talk a little bit about Lyn Yates' chapter on becoming a good education researcher.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Yeah, so Lyn's chapter is a fantastic bookend to the book. So Lyn has worked through all the methodological dialogues that constitute the text, and she decided to write her chapter in support of people who were coming to education research and trying to make sense of it. Especially those in a practical way, and how do you engage with it? So she actually identified 4 themes that she believes run through the methodological dialogues, and the first of those is the issue of theoretical work versus empirical work, and she suggests that that's a false binary. So connecting back also to Peter Roberts' chapter, which he raises that issue as well. So. So that's her first theme through the book. The second one is that the methodological dialogues situate theory. So the educational research that's conducted by these amazing researchers that we had the privilege of interviewing, the dialogues show how the situatedness of their work is so important to the generation of theory through their life and life stories. So Steve, the third point that Lyn would like to make is about philosophy compared with theory, compared with conceptual work. So that's a main theme she sees. And the final one are the practical matters to do with conducting educational research. So using theory in educational research in the way that she understands that.
Yes.